Hello and welcome to the Maid book club. Today I'm doing a 2-month reading wrap up. So in January and February combined, I finished a total of 11 books, and I'm going to go through them starting with the lowest rating and then working my way up to my 5-star reads. So starting with The Midnight Shift by Seon-ran, translated by someone, Jean Ping maybe. That is a vampire story, a Korean vampire story with a woman who is hunting vampires but not really, and there's like a nursing home where elderly people are jumping out the window, but they suspect that a vampire might be behind it. And then there's also like a queer love story, or like a couple of queer love stories, which, you know, that's great. But the book as a whole and the story as a whole didn't make sense to me. I was hoping for an emotional and suspenseful read, and I got neither. So moving on to my 3-star reads. The first one is Squire by Nadia Shammas and Sarah Alfageeh, which is a young adult fantasy graphic novel, which I really enjoyed. Like, there is absolutely nothing wrong with it. Like, 3 stars is a book that I liked. It just didn't really give me anything specifically new, and I think maybe I'm not the target audience, or like I'm not a young adult person. So even though I think the messages in that story were great, it's not something that, you know, blew my mind or anything, or hit me very hard emotionally, and the story wasn't very like eventful. But it's a beautifully illustrated graphic novel, and it's a beautiful story, and there's lots of representation in it as well. I think that was my only 3-star read, so let's move on to my 4-star reads. The first one is, let's see, The Feather Detective by Sweeney, and this is a biography about a woman called Roxy Laybourne, and she was a woman who lived throughout the 20th century, and she worked as an ornithologist. No, she worked as a scientist investigating bird feathers in different sort of cases, mostly like airplane crashes and accidents, or just like birds coming through the engines of planes. And then there are also other cases, like murder cases, where feathers are involved somehow, and they needed an expert to figure out what bird it was, and, you know, that could be used as evidence. And I just thought it was a very interesting read. I listened to it on audiobook. The narration was great, and the storytelling was great, and Roxy Laybourne sounds like an amazing person. Perhaps a little bit like, you know, grumpy, but also just like focused on her own work and not feeling the need to smile for other people's sake, which I very much respect and love. And yeah, she was just really good at her job. And this biography, you know, as it spans the 20th century, there are a lot of world events and, you know, American history that comes into play in her life as well. I'm not very interested in birds specifically, and I had never heard of this woman, and I was still very much engaged, and I learned a lot, and it was just very on a perfect, you know, level of detail. It is detailed, and it goes into the very specifics of her job, you know, looking at the feathers and all of their little properties through a microscope, and like what she used to keep track of everything. And I don't know, it was a fascinating read, and yeah, that's why I gave it 4 stars. My next 4-star read, according to my notebook, is My Husband's Wife by Alice Feeney, and I'm questioning that rating right now, and I'm thinking maybe it should be a 3-star or like a 3.5, but I don't really do half stars because I can't be bothered. It is a thriller, a new release, and lots of people who read thrillers read that one. And it was a fun, entertaining time. I wouldn't say it's like a spectacularly good book. It has a lot of flaws to it, and so that's why I think it maybe should be a 3-star. Like, objectively it's a 3, but also like it was very entertaining, and I had a good time listening to it. For the most part, it was very easy listening, and, you know, lots of twists and turns, and it was an engaging read. So I've put 4 stars here, so that's what we're going with. My next 4-star read would be The Maid and the Crocodile by Jordan Ifueko. This is a young adult fantasy. I listened to the audiobook of this as well as reading the physical copy. I did, immersion reading and switched back and forth. The setting feels very much like it is in Africa, and we follow a girl who is working as a maid. She is an orphan who has, grown out of her orphanage basically, and she is trying to make a living as a maid. And she also has this magical power. She's a curse eater, so she can sort of take away people's bad feelings through her own sort of sacrifice. And then she also has this interaction with a crocodile who is a god. There's a bit of a romance story to it as well as, some politics and stuff like that. This is set in the same world as the Raybearer duology, and I think this probably contains a few spoilers for that one, but I don't really mind. I'm not super invested in the story. I just listen to it for entertainment and like the vibes basically. It's very well written, and I loved the characters. There is some disability representation, there's queer representation, and lots of different kinds of people and characters, and there's commentary on lots of things. So yeah, this is one that I would highly recommend. My next 4-star read is another nonfiction book that I listened to on audio, and that is Rare Tongues by Lorna Gibb. Lorna Gibb is a linguist, and she has sort of taken us on a journey all around the globe, and sort of looking at different languages that have disappeared or are on the verge of disappearing, and like losing its speakers. She looks at sort of the history of that and the consequences of that and the different, social issues that creates that situation, or the situations that are created because of that. And it's not, a deep dive into all of these different languages, and you're not going to learn, how to speak any of them, but it does more so look into like how come the languages are not spoken anymore, usually colonialism and oppression, and, prohibiting people from speaking their mother tongue, which is something that has been practiced a lot of different places as a means of, power. And to take power away from people, because if you force everyone to speak the language that you understand, then they can't say things that you don't understand. And so, yeah, stuff like that. And then it's also talking about the effects of languages being lost and like all of the knowledge and experience that is embedded in the language itself, ecological terminology and like understanding of the environment, or like, weather or plants, or just how things work. There's meaning in what you call a plant, whether it's edible or usable for something else. And like, it has all of these associations and connotations that are not always translatable, or the knowledge is just lost when nobody knows that word anymore. Yeah, there are just lots of things like that, and lots of ways that language holds power, and can be used to abuse power. So yeah, I thought that was a very interesting read. I love languages, and I think this book is perfect for someone who is not a linguist, because it's kind of surface level, but it's more like, it's not about languages themselves, it's more like languages as a factor in society, or like for people in these different situations. My next 4-star read was We Don't Talk About Carol by Kristen L. Berry. It follows a woman who finds a picture of her aunt, who she never knew existed because no one in her family talks about her. And she finds out that her aunt was one of 6 Black girls to go missing in the 60s. The book is her trying to figure that out, and figuring out both her family history, as well as trying to solve the case of these missing girls. And then there's also the relationships between this woman, the main character, and her family members, and her husband, and they are talking about having children or not having children, and IVF treatments and things like that. I thought it was a very engaging read. It was very readable, very well written, and very interesting topics of discussion. And I would highly recommend it to anyone who likes general fiction or mysteries, or a mix of the two, and especially combined with Black history. yeah, I thought it was great. And then my last 4-star is apparently All the Ever Afters by Danielle Teller. I, again, didn't remember giving this 4 stars, but for what it was, I think it was pretty good. And I do think it's sort of mismarketed because this is a retelling of the stepmother of Cinderella. And it's listed as fantasy, like it's tagged as fantasy on, Goodreads and Storygraph and things. But there's no element of fantasy in this apart from the fact that Cinderella is a character from a fairy tale. Cinderella is not really a prominent part of this, and there's no magic, there's no like magical cart or, fairy godmother or magical shoe. It reads more like historical fiction, and it just takes that character and like imagines her as a real person and what her life might have been like and the struggles she might have gone through. It starts out when she's a kid and she has to go work places and, make a living, and men in her life and having children, the evil stepsisters, and, why are they like that? And then coming into the situation with Cinderella. I thought all of that was really well done. I think it's well written, and I think I had expected it to be more of a fantasy novel or more of a like typical retelling. If you just go into it knowing that it's a historical fiction and it's just going to follow the stepmother throughout her life, I think it's a very well done book. So that leaves my 5-star reads. I have 3 of them, and 2 of them I have already talked about pretty detailedly in a vlog that I will leave a link to. The first one is The Harpy by Megan Hunter. This is literary fiction about a woman who finds out that her husband has cheated on her, and they sort of make an agreement that she is allowed to punish him for this 3 times, and he won't know in what way or when. It lived up to all of my expectations. There's a sense of dread, sort of. You're just wondering what she's going to do, and we go along on this journey with her, how it came about that she found out, and how she punishes him, and all of the things that happen in the meantime. It's a little bit weird, but in just the right amount for me. I had a really good time. I think I read this in one day, and I loved it. The other 5-star read that I also talked about in the same vlog as The Harpy is James by Percival Everett. This follows James, who is the enslaved man in Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. It's a retelling of the same story, but from James' perspective. When James and Huck Finn go their different ways, we follow James instead. I do wish that I had read Huck Finn before this one, because I think there are things that I don't think they went over my head. Like, I understand the differences and like the things that I assume are not in Huck Finn, because they just wouldn't be. There's a lot of history in here, Black history, from a Black person's perspective, that just could not have been in Huck Finn. But at the same time, like, I would have benefited, I think, just from having the two to like contrast and compare. I think it's hard to understand just how impactful this novel is or could be or would be if you don't have Huck Finn to compare to, because like this to me is not mind-blowing in the sense that I'm like, oh my god, is that how it was? Like, it makes perfect sense to me, and so it's not this like shock of like a whole new perspective that I had no idea about. You know what I mean? This perspective isn't as strong without the other perspective to show how much of a difference this makes, because this is written in conversation with that novel. So if you don't have that part of the dialogue, there are going to be points that are being missed, right? So like, I can recognize this as a phenomenal novel, but I do think that it needs the other context. It's very much a novel written in a context, and so the story sort of stands on its own, but it stands on its own as much as Huck Finn does, I guess. Like, the story itself is not original. The originality of this novel is in conversation with the original. Like, this is the new spin on it, and you don't understand what the retelling is if you don't know the original. I think that it's very much worth a read. I highly recommend listening to the audiobook as you read it, because I don't think that either the physical copy or the audiobook on their own would have been as strong. Sometimes I was helped by the audio and sometimes I was helped by the physical copy. Anyways, this is great, and I gave it 5 stars. And then my final 5-star from January and February is Confessions by Kanae Minato. This is translated from the Japanese by Snyder, and it's a thriller, I would say. It's told in sort of 5 parts, or like chapters. They're very long chapters or like parts, but like the novel is not very long in itself, so it goes by quickly. There's also a lot of tension and suspense and some moments of gasping and just going, did that really happen? It's about a teacher who realizes or finds out or shares that she knows that her students are responsible for her daughter's death. Then there's consequences from that. I flew through it. I didn't want to put it down. I wanted to get back to it as soon as I did. And yeah, it's just very engaging and very suspenseful and tense. I would say it's a very tense novel and original. I loved the premise of it and I loved where it went. I wish I could read it again. I mean, I can, but like, you know, for the first time. That's my January and February reading wrap up done. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a fantastic day and I will see you in the next one. Bye.